I am Jonathan Sacerdoti. I'm a writer, analyst, broadcaster who has spent a number of years covering Israel and the Middle East as well as UK politics.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today. I'm sorry that we're running late. As I said earlier, the committee is keen to that this inquiry focuses on the UK government's role and their role in helping to find peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, what we have done until now and what we could do in the future as a country. And I wondered if I could ask Ebba Morello to set off for the questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for joining us. I think it'd be helpful to understand what you believe the aims of the Israeli government are with the conflict in Gaza at the moment. What are their stated aims, and to what extent the way in which they are perpetrating the conflict is likely to deliver those outcomes?
The most obvious direct answer is that the Israeli government was forced into action after October the 7th, 2023, with the horrific and brutal invasion of southern Israel by Palestinian terrorists who slaughtered, kidnapped, raped, tortured and kept prisoners. All
of which we've had a lot of evidence about, but in terms of what the aims of the government are in Gaza at this time, what do you believe those aims are?
As I was going to go on to say, I believe that the aims of the government are to react to that threat, which proved itself very formidable on that day, and also to try to achieve the return of the hostages. There are still 59 of them being kept in the Gaza Strip, which is a humanitarian issue that the whole international community ought to be uniting behind, but it's one that's had relatively little proper support. Indeed, I believe that the Israeli government and the Israeli military is engaging in a war not just on that front, but one which also has confronted the other threats, whether it has been Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon, or whether it has been the direct threat from Iran, which has rocketed the country twice, whether it has been from the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and whether it has been from elsewhere in the region. Israel has been, I believe, trying to reassert its military dominance in that region in order to protect itself against jihadi Islamic terrorism and forces which are dedicated towards the eradication of the State of Israel and furthermore towards killing Jewish people both in the State of Israel and around the world, as explained by many of those forces, including the Iranians who are behind all of those proxies. So I believe that Israel is engaged in, and quite successfully so, reasserting its military abilities to hold at bay enemies on multiple fronts in order to try to keep the safety of the citizens of Israel, and also in order to provide a continued homeland for Jews who are at threat from rising anti-Semitism around the globe, who have a right to go and move to Israel in order to be protected from the kind of genocidal acts that took place both on that day and throughout the Jews' past.
It is perpetrating the conflict in Gaza, in terms of how Israel or the IDF or the government is carrying out the war in Gaza. How effective is it at delivering those outcomes? And if, as you've stated, the only outcome is a sense of security and the return of the prisoners,
hostages, not prisoners.
So, if that is the only end game, then what is the end game for the Palestinians? So there's two elements to that question. Is the way it's perpetrating the conflict at the moment conducive to achieving the release of the hostages? And actually, if hostages and security for Israel is the only desired outcome, what does, to use the Chair's question, Israel look like in 10 years' time?
I'll try and answer that because I think it's a few questions rolled into one. So if you'll forgive me. The intended outcome for the Palestinians, you would have to ask them why they invaded Israel on that day, what their intended outcome was. But I think that the resulting outcome is that the proposition of some sort of negotiated settlement that would work more in their favour than is now the case has been pushed way into the long grass because of the horrific threats that actually manifested on that day. So I don't know what their objective aim was. I think it was to bring back the issue of Palestinian national self-determination because it had slipped off the world's radar because of the Abraham Accords, among other things, which had seen other Arab countries in the Middle East accepting that this intractable problem, due mostly to Palestinian rejectionism and maximalism, They had really sort of bypassed that following the Trump and Netanyahu agenda of trying to create a regional accord that would allow a Jewish state in Israel to thrive alongside Arab states.
We have heard evidence from the Palestinian side as well. I'm very keen to sort of understand in terms of what Israel is trying to achieve, and actually, whether or not the way the war is being carried out is a route to the return of the hostages, the safe return of the hostages, a route to safety and security for Israel, and a route to X what? What is the 10 years? What is the 10-year plan?
So I would say it's a mixed forecast on my part in terms of those issues. The main restriction, the main problem for the Israelis in carrying this out properly and effectively is indeed that there are people starving in Gaza, there are people being raped in Gaza and abused in Gaza. Those are the hostages that the Palestinian terrorists are keeping there. And they made a great show of how badly they've been treating them repeatedly through videos and those hideous performances they put on as part of the release part of the ceasefire agreement. Because of that, Israel has been rather held back from managing to engage in the war in a way that would be more decisive and quicker. And I also think that the previous US administration under Joe Biden also, whilst being very supportive of Israel's war effort, did at times throttle Israel's ability to carry out that war in a way that would have been more decisive. So I do think that you're right to point out that there may be some limitations on the way Israel's undertaking the war. I think the main reason for those limitations in order to achieve its main goals has been that it's restricted by some very, very difficult circumstances, most notably the hostages. Now, is it working to get the hostages back? I would say yes and no. Obviously, there is a demand among all people of good faith and goodwill around the world that the hostages ought to be released immediately without any preconditions. They ought to just be released, because you don't take hostages of civilians from their beds or from their homes and keep them for well over a year. This is just not something that is done. The world should be putting pressure on all of those state actors behind the Palestinian terrorists who are doing this, whether it's Qatar or Turkey or Iran, of course. So I think that there could be more support from the international community, including the UK government, in order to try to achieve that, so that Israel's abilities aren't really just restricted to how it can engage in this war. And I would say that it has been quite successful in that it's got back around 80% of the hostages. Now, there's a very big caveat. Some of them were dead and tortured and murdered. Some of them are still there. Some of those who are still there are also known to be dead. So it's not totally effective. But as I think is often the case in Israel's dilemmas and problems, you need to look at the circumstances which show that it's not offered a very beautiful solution that's going to be easy and a horrid one. It's offered two really horrid ones. And in this case, it's trying to conduct itself according to the rules of law, according to the rule of law, according to international human rights law, according to the rules of war, and according to the fact that it's a democratic country, a country that's had this vast hit to it of hostages and murdered and engaging in this ongoing war, which has been brutal on the nation. It has to try and find its way through those thickets. And that's why I think this committee's work is so important, because countries like ours, which are allies to democratic, liberal Israel, ought to be finding ways to support it in that fight in order to make it the least bad war it can be. But wars are horrible.
Can I just, you raise an interesting point, which is that some of the hostages, unfortunately many dead, were released, but those were released under a ceasefire agreement.
Which is the cessation of the brutal war that forced Hamas into releasing them.
Okay, so I go back to my earlier point, which is about what this journey looks like to something that is a safe and secure Israel, and actually to what extent the continuation of since the end of the ceasefire, the war in Gaza and the way that it's being perpetrated, is there any suggestion in your mind that that is bringing about, whether that be you escalate to the point that you have a ceasefire that is welcomed by the other side and is willing to get hostages, or is the expectation that you just continue to ratchet up in the hope that at some point, what I'm trying to understand, and we've talked about this a couple of times within even this session, which is not the next day, it's how you get to the next day. And that's the bit that I want to understand. What is your view in the appropriate route to go from where you are right now to talking about the next day?
I think the problem, if we're going to look at the validity of what they're doing now and try and assess whether or not it's a smart way to bring about the release of the remaining hostages, dead and alive, I would say you need to look at the alternative possibilities. So an instant ceasefire and withdrawal from the Gaza Strip of all Israeli forces. And according to what reports have said, the Palestinians have requested a commitment with some sort of international backing up of it, that Israel cannot go back to war, that this is a permanent end to war. I would effectively characterize that as a surrender, because what it would do is leave in power the terrorist organization Hamas, which is not only genocidally intended towards Israel, but also is brutal and punishing of Palestinians within the Gaza Strip. And I would say that it also doesn't really guarantee the release of all of the hostages, because Hamas doesn't act like an honest or rational or humanitarian player. And I would say that furthermore, what you then have to look at is Israel's security, the other issue I mentioned, other than the hostage release. Not only have you left in place that brutal force, that jihadi force in Gaza, backed by Iran, but you also are then faced with the question, what will happen next? What the Arab world will see, Israel's Arab enemies will see, including Hamas, but also including all the others, is that all they need to do is kidnap civilians.
Can I just make sure I understand your evidence? You're not saying that all of Israel's Arab neighbours are enemies, are you?
No, I said all of Israel's Arab enemies. There are indeed neighbours of Israel who have made peace accords, and there are members of Israel's neighbours who have signed up to the Abraham Accords. Absolutely not. I believe there is a very interesting and thriving part of the Middle East that is very keen to see a Jewish state succeeding in the land of Israel and cooperating with them. But if I may go back just to that point, which is
I just wanted to make sure that I understood what you were saying.
I think you did, yes. Now, I hope, anyway.
I do now.
Okay, good. I think that the thing I would say is that the moment they decide to seize more hostages, this all starts again. And what is bound to encourage jihadi Islamic terrorism to seize hostages is the kind of deal that Israel is being forced to make. And that's been seen throughout the history, from the Jibril deal, originally sort of the blueprint of Israel's first decision to swap Palestinian prisoners, terrorists in Israeli jails, for people who are seized and kept hostage by jihadi terrorist groups. This is a pattern that Israel is forced to repeat, but the more that we try and force it to maximize the price for releasing the hostages, the more in the future the security element of that sort of alternative arrangement to the one we're seeing now will be dreadful for Israel, dreadful for Israeli civilians who know that given half a chance, those same forces, and it's not just Hamas, it's the other terrorist forces in Gaza, it's even the civilians we watched in the videos they streamed themselves, will burst into Israel, they will rape, they will steal, they will kidnap, they will murder, they will take hostages. So giving in to terrorist hostage taking is something that Israel also has to weigh very carefully when trying to get back those civilians.
But can I ask a question, therefore, another way? I'm going to answer Edward's questions in another way. So you've been asked about what's the future of Israel in 10 years, what's the objective, how's it going to work? You know, given the things that you want, that you understand the Israeli government, as it's currently formed, wants, and you've told us all the things that you don't want, but it's not really clear what it is and how we're going to get to where it is that you want to get. So can I ask it this way? How ideally do you see Gaza in 10 years' time?
Well, I'm not a soothsayer or fortune teller. It's very hard to know how.
Well, what would be a good outcome?
I would say that a good outcome would be the elimination in Gaza of the forces which are committed to genocidal acts on Israel and Jews, like Hamas. It's in their charter. And it's also in their actions, as we saw on October the 7th. And I would say that a Gaza which is meaningfully de-radicalized, a Gaza which sees education of its population towards peace and coexistence, a Gaza which is utterly demilitarized, a Gaza which doesn't just say that it has the ability, the intention not to murder and kill Jews and to eliminate Israel, but also has no ability to do so if they're lying or change their mind. A Gaza which allows Palestinians within it to thrive and live good lives should they choose to forego those principles of Islamic jihadism. That kind of Gaza could be one that could be achieved and could provide a brighter future, not just for Israelis, the neighbours who they attacked on October the 7th, but also for the people living within Gaza. Now, there's a lot of steps to getting there.
And would they be Israelis, or would they be within a Palestinian nation, or what would be their status?
Depends on an awful lot of steps towards getting there.
No, I understand that. I mean, I know what I think, but I mean, tell me what you think. I mean, so in 10 years' time, should Gaza be part of Israel? Or should Gaza be part of a Palestinian state, or something else?
Well, there isn't currently a Palestinian state, so the question I suppose you're asking me is if I believe that we should establish one within the next 10 years?
I'm just wondering what the future is. I'm trying to get from you, not, this is terrible, we can't have this, we can't have that. I mean, I understand all of that.
I hope you agree with
But what we're trying to do, of course. What we're looking for is what peace looks like and what a positive future looks like and how we get there. And in order to be able to get there, we need to be able to understand what we agree on and what peace could look like and where we have common ground. And that's what I'm asking you.
Also, I believe that the common ground are the steps that need to be taken towards getting to whatever that 10-year vision is, which is demilitarization, de-radicalization, de-jihadism, educating towards living peacefully with your neighbours. I believe all of those things will get us to a solution within 10 years if the international community, including Great Britain, chooses to prioritise those things rather than choosing to perhaps sometimes engage in gestures which I think run the risk of making either side feel that they're not getting what they want in terms of an unachievable goal. If the goal can be peaceful coexistence and can be a rejection of violence, then I think that 10-year vision, yes, we can perhaps hope that it could be a state. We can perhaps hope that it could be some sort of emirate situation. I don't know what the solution is. As I said, I really have no ability to foresee it. If you'd asked me 2 years ago if I would have foreseen the Middle East as it is today, if you'd asked any analyst of the Middle East if they would have foreseen the fall of Assad in Syria, the virtual destruction of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the situation in Iran where Israel managed to strike and remove so much of the defense systems, the air defense systems, etc., 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 even October the 7th itself, I think you would be hard-pressed to find somebody that could have predicted all that, and that's just 2 years ago.
Of course, but the question is this. Real political leadership has to have some sort of vision as to where it is that it wants to go. Mm-hmm. And what we're scrabbling to try to find is where it is that the current leadership of Israel wants to go. What does it want to achieve? And that was the question that Ed's been asking. That's the questions I've been asking.
Well, I think the answer to that is that the State of Israel would like to live in a state of security with any neighbours of it that are willing to commit to that. And furthermore, as it's proven in all of its actions, including the Abraham Accords, but including throughout its history, where there is an Arab partner for peace or for normalising relations, it reaches out its hand to do so. Indeed, it's a state that's also given away large amounts of land in return for those sorts of agreements, even when they aren't particularly rosy. I'm talking, for example, about the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. So what I would say is that the State of Israel's vision is that. The question that you're asking me, I think, is whether or not the Palestinians have a shared vision, and I think this is key. If the Palestinian identity and political mainstream can commit to a similar sort of vision where they're going to coexist with Israel peacefully, and that there will be some form of compromise towards getting a goal they want, that can be achieved. But I think that as long as they pursue in mainstream Palestinian politics, whether it's Hamas or Fatah or any other part of mainstream Palestinian politics, as long as they continue to pursue the rewarding of acts of terrorism through so-called pay-for-slay, through a number of other means, through preaching in their mosques, including Fatah mosques, including in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the longer that they pursue a continuation of terrorism and extremism and jihadism, I don't see how that's going to be possible. But if they present a viable option for Israel to coexist with, I think they will find a partner in Israel in order to reach that. I think that's a question really for Palestinian politicians.
Absolutely.
Thank you. You mentioned a word earlier, rejectionism. How do we deal with Israeli rejectionism in the West Bank, where there's an ever-increasing number of settlements? I think 2024 had the highest number of land grabs, 24,000 dunams were declared as land state land, sorry. How do we deal with that? So Israel doesn't want to see the West Bank go under Palestinian sovereignty. What are your views?
I think at various times in its history and in the history of the conflict, Israel has, according to reports from people like Bill Clinton and even Israeli prime ministers who've recently shown maps and the like, has proposed very favourable settlements to the issues of those disputed territories. I think that right now, after the atrocities of October the 7th, much of the, let's say, traditionally left peace camp in Israel has really been massively disillusioned by what happened from its Palestinian neighbours.
Does that justify violent settlers?
I'm not trying to justify anything. I'm not here to defend or anything. I'm just giving you my analysis in answer to your question of what I make of the current situation. So I think that the opinion of many Israeli citizens, and not all, they're certainly not a homogenous group, it's a thriving democracy, but the opinion of much of Israeli society has changed drastically over the last 18 months since that horrific attack. And I think that many who were of the tendency to try to give land in return for peace have found themselves disillusioned again and again over time. And so I suspect that the prospect of trying to convince Israeli people, as well as many Israeli politicians, that land concessions will stop the continued threat, which is very manifest, as we saw on October the 7th and before and after it. I think that it will be very difficult to convince them of that. So what I would suggest is that if that is one's aim and agenda, especially as allied countries, for example, the UK, it would be a really good idea and a strong idea to try to convince Israel. We often talk about confidence building in the actions that states take towards the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinian Arabs. I think that often that confidence building has not been enough on the side of building the confidence of the Israelis, who have a very obvious fear of the brutality of those neighbours it's expected to negotiate with and make peace with. And so if we can give in any way, diplomatically or politically, some sort of support to our democratic ally in Israel, that they are going to be able to ensure their security, that is more likely, I think.
In terms of settlement expansions then, do you think that they should come to an end, or do you think that they should carry on as they are?
Well, I think the issues of the disputed territories in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, it's a live issue that has always been part of the negotiations when they've been able to take place between the two sides. I think that there are obviously many good arguments for them to stop. I think there are many good arguments as well in part of negotiations that have been tried and tested by both sides, and they've always been rejected by the Palestinians in negotiations ultimately. In fact, it was Bill Clinton who recently said that in a public address, that the option offered by him 25 years ago was so favourable that it's extraordinary that anyone should think it should remain today after the complete rejection of it.
Thank you. Do you think our government should do more to prevent the expansion of settlements?
I think our government should very much focus on the cause that might be behind Israeli actions, as I said, which is to build confidence on their part that their security won't be overlooked. So a lot of the issue to do with the territories in the West Bank...
So if there's
I'll tell you. A lot of the issues to do with territory in that region is to do with security and safety. So obviously Israel is a very tiny country, and at its minimum waste there, should there be, let's say, a surrender of all of those disputed territories, it would mean that the kind of attack that we saw take place, the brutal Palestinian terrorist attack from Gaza that we saw take place on October the 7th, could actually take place on Israel's major cities in central Israel as well, from those putative Palestinian territories. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why the popularity of negotiating over those territories and Israel giving them away is one that has really waned in popularity in Israeli society, because there is a very justifiable fear that should those pieces of land be given over to people who have still not de-radicalized or decided to stop waging an exterminative war on the State of Israel, there is an increased danger there.
Is your view everybody who lives in the West Bank, Palestinians that live there, potentially at risk of radicalisation and that can never sort of...
Well, I know that you've had written evidence from Impact SE about the Palestinian educational curriculum. So I know that you'll be familiar, if you've read that, with the incitement and the sorts of claims that are taught to children from a very young age. Indeed, Palestinian television broadcasts as well, whether it's been the sermons from Fatah mosques in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or whether it has been Gaza. We've done better
than that. Nearly everybody on this committee has had the benefit of being able to visit the area, the disputed area, as you call it, and be able to meet people and to talk to them and to work out for ourselves whether or not they have been radicalised or can potentially be radicalised. And I think that's, it's important, of course, for parliamentarians to visit the area so that they can reach their own conclusions on that matter.
Yes, and I also have visited those regions and met many people there as well myself. And I would say that, if you're asking me, are there any people who identify as Palestinian in that area who are committed to peaceful coexistence, who are not radicalised? Well, of course there are. I think that the challenge for those people is that they're very often treated by their own leadership and their own mainstream political parties in a very deeply problematic way that means that they're not really able to pursue that agenda, if that is their agenda, because there is so much pushing them and their children and future generations towards a continuation of a sort of narrative of infinite and never-ending resistance, which ultimately means resistance to the existence of the State of Israel all too often. And I think that is part of the problem.
There's no hope.
But there's been hope many times.
But at the moment, and for the past few decades, if you were a Palestinian living on the West Bank or in East Jerusalem or in Gaza, you would think there was no hope. There was no possibility of you being able to have equal rights with Israelis or to have your own state. And that is the day-to-day existence of Palestinians. There's certainly those that we have met.
Well, I agree with you that if there are Palestinians who you've met and who I've met who are committed to peaceful coexistence with Israelis and foresee a situation in the future where the conflict is ended and they can coexist side by side with a Jewish Israeli state, then it's absolutely a massive tragedy that they haven't got political leadership which has managed to manifest that with the State of Israel, which has made peace with other Arab neighbours, which has made accords with other Arab countries in order to prove and just to benefit from the result of those accords and agreements. There is definitely within the Israeli population's desires the desire for all this to end. But I think that anybody that saw what happened on October the 7th can be very clear that the fantasy that tomorrow one can simply declare statehood of a people that literally invaded, raped, murdered and tortured, including civilians from Gaza, we all saw them. I think it is a fantasy at this stage, or at least in the eyes of many Israelis I speak to, both on the street and in politics, even those who dislike passionately this government and this Prime Minister in Israel. They still feel that fantasy is much, much further away. And I agree that creating hope on both sides is really the key to moving things forwards. But I would say that what has dashed hope, what has ruined hope, what has abandoned hope, what has killed hope for Israelis and for any Palestinians you've just described is the actions of those Palestinian terrorists who've said they would do it again and again and who are proving it, backed up by a jihadi, tyrannical, theocratic regime in the Islamic Republic of Iran who are still engaging in those activities, not just against Israel, but against this country. They kidnapped our sailors. They kidnapped Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. They are attacking international trade. And this is a problem that all of the world, all of the West needs to unite behind. It's not just an issue anymore about Israel and Jews.
Afra and Blair, I don't know if either of you had a question.
Fine noting.
Can I come back to... I welcome you keep coming back to the need to promote peaceful coexistence. And one of the things we're trying to get to from this inquiry is what is Britain's sort of USP in helping to get to that. And one of the things I'm concerned about, I wonder if you share the concern, is the proposed law for Knesset around taxing NGOs funded from overseas at 80%. It feels like that's a sort of blockage for if Britain, for example, wanted to continue to invest in peace-building organisations, because we've obviously got two deeply traumatised communities. So it's more important than ever that work is supported. I wonder if you share my concern about that law.
Well, I think that the issue of what Britain can do, especially in terms of NGOs and international bodies, is to try to focus on those which aren't part of the problem and which haven't been really repeatedly shown to undermine peace. So I would list among those UNRWA. Indeed, there were many pieces of evidence that Israel provided, but also that were provided by the Palestinians themselves in the videos they released on October the 7th, showing UNRWA vehicles or even UNRWA staff engaging in actual acts of terrorism, dragging a corpse into a car. One of the hostages, at least, I remember, said they were kept in an UNRWA teacher's house. Another said they were guarded over by UNRWA people. I think that the UK indeed needs to look very closely at international bodies which purport to be helping the Palestinians, but actually are doing a dreadful job for the Palestinians and for Israel's security. And so it would do Britain, I suppose, a lot of good to try to work more actively to dismantle structural biases against Israel in international bodies like the UN, and also to cease funding UNRWA because of those sorts of links. And again...
I was looking really at the funding of NGOs, grassroots organisations within
I think
Israel and Palestine, which do peace building, and whether that law makes that job more difficult, because you've rightly said that has to be a priority given the trauma that's there.
Well, I think that if you've got concerns over a law like that in Israel, the best way to deal with that is as part of the international community, it's to help bolster international bodies that aren't compromised in that way. And so that means...
I'm not talking about international bodies funding. I'm talking about the funding of grassroots projects within Israel and Palestine, civil society organisations, and that law potentially being a blockage to the international community being able to do that.
So I suppose what I'm saying is that often when members of the international community wish to provide aid or financial aid for humanitarian purposes for Palestinians, they're doing so through bodies that the State of Israel, rightly or wrongly, and that's something that would need a very detailed discussion between us. Maybe we don't have time for it now. I'd be very happy to engage in it. But bodies that they say are not committed to fairness and are not committed to peace, but are committed in some way, in their opinion, towards the perpetuation of the conflict. And so I would say that the best way we could target that, other than perhaps having an opinion like yours that you don't like this action of Israel, is to try to bolster the organisations which aren't doing that, and to try to agree with our ally Israel on why it feels that way about certain bodies, so that they wouldn't feel this sort of defensive need to do that kind of thing. If they know that Britain and other nations are able to provide funding for Palestinians in a way that won't be hijacked by Hamas and other terrorist groups and used against Israel, and if they know that commitment, that financial commitment, won't be used to educate and indoctrinate against Israel Jews and in the pursuit of jihadism, then I think that they won't even be thinking about those sorts of laws. Instead, they'll be the ones, I think, first in line to help support the bolstering of the parts of Palestinian society which actually might help to resolve the problem. And I think that I am quite sympathetic to them on that front.
Thank you. Unless there's any other questions, I think we're going to draw this session to a close. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And if you believe that there is anything else that we should have asked you about once you leave today, then please do write in and give that evidence in writing.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.